The wind on Belt Traxxas 3 tasted like burnt metal and lies. It clawed at the skin with a thin, acrid bite, dragging the stink of upper-tier runoff down through the skeletal ruins of District 9. Fog moved like bruised silk through the alleys, pooling in gutters lined with rust and frost that wasn't frost at all, just chemical ash settling after another long night of smog. Above, neon signs sputtered their last gasps of light, sickly pink and blue flickers stabbing through haze, thick enough to choke a man. Baron Holt stood in that breathless cold, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a coat patched too many times to count. His left leg ached from the old injury, the steel brace biting with every step he took, but habit dragged him outside at dawn the way it always did. He told himself he needed air, even if that air was poison. Mostly, he needed to remind himself the world still turned, even if most days he wished it wouldn't. His shop sat wedged between two collapsed towers, a box of corrugated panels and welded plates, as stubborn as he was. Inside, he fixed things: rusted mag drills, stripped power couplers, broken courier drones. Machines were simple. They didn't scream when you opened them. They didn't look at you with eyes asking for hope you didn't have. That was why he chose machines over people years ago. He unzipped, took a piss against the drain pipe, and was about to limp back inside when something shifted at the edge of his vision. Under the rusted awning beside his door, what he'd thought was garbage discarded insulation wrap or shredded tarp moved. A slow, shivering tremor. Darren froze, every muscle tightening like a wire, ready to snap. He stepped closer, boots scraping against wet concrete. The shape huddled tighter. Not a thing. Not trash. Two figures tangled together, small, breathing. Alien Dot, the taller one, felt him first. She jerked upright, crouching low in a stance that screamed fight before flight. Her skin caught the dim neon glow, a pale green so faint it looked dusted with frost. Black hair clung to her face, streaked with violet like spilled dye, and her amber eyes slit sharp as blades. Behind her, the smaller girl clung like a shadow, arms looped tight around the other's waist. Her hair spilled down her back in a mess of tangled silver, sticking to bare shoulders that shook with cold. The scraps on their bodies weren't clothes, not really torn veils, ceremonial cloth strips barely covering skin. Auction silks. Darren's gut twisted hard. He didn't speak. Words would spook them. Out here, fear got you killed faster than frostbite. They weren't locals. They weren't tourists. And nobody wore silk unless someone had owned them. Or still did. He unlocked his steel door slow, hinges groaning in the quiet, then pushed it wide enough for the neon glare to paint the floor inside. He looked back once, voice low and even. Both of you, come in. Before someone else finds you. For a moment, nothing moved. Just fog curling around bare feet, their breath rising in tight white ribbons. Then the taller one shifted, pulling the smaller girl with her. Silent, wary, like feral things expecting the trap to snap shut. They crossed the threshold without a sound. Darren closed the door behind them. The lock slid into place with a heavy click that hung in the air like a promise or a threat. Silence after was sharp as a drawn blade. Asterisk, the heater hung faintly in the corner, its glow throwing a weak circle of amber against steel walls. Inside, the air wasn't warm. Not really, but compared to the knife-edged cold outside, it was close enough to feel like a promise. Darren moved slowly, shoulders square, hands easy and open as he crossed to the far workbench. The two girls stayed just inside the door, silent, dripping a fine mist from their hair onto the metal floor. He didn't look at them directly. That was rule one in a city like this. Never corner a stray, human or not. Instead, he reached for the crate under his bench and hauled out two shirts, old thermal things patched at the sleeves. He set them near the heater, then turned the sink valve. A trickle of water ran warm enough to sting frozen skin. "Wash, if I's." "You want," he said, voice level, like he was talking to the wall. "Don't break anything." Nothing answered. Not words, not sound, just the faint shift of bare feet on metal. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw them move, the tall one first, dragging the smaller girl close with one arm. She bent low, sniffed the shirt like a street dog checking a scrap, then guided her companion forward. The taller one didn't relax. Not even an inch. Her eyes tracked him with the flat focus of someone who's been hunted too long to believe in luck. Darren sat back at his bench, solder wand in hand, pretending the drone guts scattered in front of him were all that mattered. His pulse said, otherwise, machines didn't breathe, they didn't bleed, and they sure as hell didn't make you wonder how two females ended up barefoot and half naked in the dead fog of District 9 behind him. Water splashed. Quiet, careful movements. Fabric rustled as they stripped off the silk rags. He didn't turn. Didn't need to. He kept his eyes on the circuit board and told himself the crack in his chest wasn't pity. Just the cold. 10 minutes later, when he finally glanced back, they were curled together on the cot near the heater. Oversized shirts swallowing there. Frames, damp hair plastered to their necks. The smaller one had folded herself into the other's arms, head tucked under her chin like a child hiding from the dark. The taller one didn't sleep. Not even close. Her amber eyes locked on Darren like a blade tip waiting to strike. He stared back for one long second and looked away first. The day crawled by. He worked. They watched. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the steel shutters like a living thing. He was halfway through reassembling a plasma coupler when the first bang hit the front hatch. A sharp, metallic thud that echoed through the shop like a gunshot. Darren froze, pulse spiking, then pushed to his feet. He knew that knock. Knew the voice that came next even better. "Yo, Holt." A laugh, low and ugly. "You open?" "Got something." Worth trading, grinned Malvik. Scavenger, hustler, and part-time flesh broker for the outer tier auction routes. Darren unlocked the interior slot and slid it open an inch. Malvik's grin filled the gap yellow teeth flashing under a scar scored. "Face. Hear things, Holt," Grin drawled, eyes flicking over Darren's shoulder. "Whispers. Two denders loose. Pretty. Untagged. You seen anyone like that?" Darren's jaw tightened. He kept his voice flat. "Shop's closed. Try Sector 11. Grin smirked. Sure. Just thought maybe..." The wrench in Darren's fist slammed the steel doorframe with a crack loud enough to rattle bolts. The sound shot down the alley like a warning flare. "Sector 11, Darren repeated, cold as oxygen frost. For a long second, Malvik held his grin. Then he raised both hands slow, palms out. "All right, friend. Just asking." Bootsteps faded into fog. Darren bolted the shutter, hard, and turned. The cot was empty. For half a breath, panic flared. Then he saw them crouched behind the workbench, bodies pressed tight into shadow, wide eyes shining like coins in the dark. The smaller one's lips moved, whispering something soft in a language he didn't know. The taller one didn't blink, didn't breathe wrong. Darren dropped the wrench, its clang splitting the silence. His voice came low, even. "No one's coming in here without going through me." They didn't answer. But this time, the hard edge in the taller girl's shoulders loosened, just a fraction, like a lock testing its first click. Outside, the fog rolled thicker, swallowing the alley whole. Inside, 3 people waited for what none of them could name, and Darren knew one thing for sure. If Malvik came back, it wasn't going to end with words. Asterisk the fog outside, turned the alley into a smear of gray. But inside the shop, time slowed to a crawl. Darren worked in silence, the buzz of his solder iron the only sound against the hum of the heater. Every so often, he glanced toward the cot, expecting to find it empty, expecting them to vanish like smoke. But they stayed two fragile shapes. In patched shirts, tucked close under the flickering heat-strip dot, it wasn't comfort. Not yet. The taller one predator eyes, dark hair streaked violet, never stopped watching him. Even when she moved, it was like a knife sliding across glass. Quiet, precise, ready to cut. The smaller one, though. She slept. Or tried to. Curled against the other, like a vine clinging to stone. Her breath trembled in soft, uneven pulls. A sound that shouldn't have belonged to someone who'd survived Beltrax's nights. Darren forced his attention back to the circuit board. Hands. Steady, mind burning. Questions chewed at the edges of his thoughts until the silence grew heavier than the smog outside. Finally, he broke it, not loud, not sharp, just enough to ripple the air. You plan on staying mute forever? His voice came flat, almost mechanical. Or are you going to tell me who's looking for you? The taller one didn't answer. Her gaze held his like a clamp, testing for weakness. Seconds ticked. Then, slowly, she shifted, uncrossed her arms, rested one palm against the cot frame. Her voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, like gravel dragged over metal. They bought us for a party, she said, every word clipped, cold. A diplomat. He wanted something to show off. Something different. Her jaw tightened until the scar on her cheek stood out pale against her skin. Then he changed his mind. Darren stared at her. His throat felt like dry copper. Changed his mind? He said I looked wrong. Said she, a flick of her head toward the smaller girl, still curled in sleep, was too soft. Her voice cracked on that word, not from weakness, but from rage chained so tight it bled. They dumped us behind a freight depot 3 nights ago. Darren said nothing. He didn't need to. The bruises under their collars, the welts peeking from the shirt's hem, they'd already told most of the story. He asked anyway, "You tagged?" She shook her head once. No implants. Off-record stock sells faster. No trace. No questions. That landed heavy. Darren dragged a hand over his beard, rough stubble catching his skin. Off-record meant no one was looking to rescue them, but someone would come to reclaim what they'd lost. Men like Grin didn't just sniff for rumor. They followed orders. He looked at her again. "What's your name?" She blinked, slow, like the word didn't fit her mouth anymore. "Rava." "And her?" "Lynn." A beat. "She doesn't talk much." Darren glanced toward Lynn's small frame under the thermal shirt, silver hair spilling like molten wire across the blanket. Too still for sleep. Her eyes opened a fraction, blue and wide as frost pools. And for the first time, she spoke. "Are you going to turn us in?" The question hit like a nail through steel. "No," Darren said, without pause, without air. "Why?" Her voice was soft, brittle, but her eyes, those eyes, demanded an answer. He leaned back against the bench, the hum of the heater filling the gap where his pulse should have been. "Because I've seen what happens to people who get left outside." His voice dropped, rough, low. "And I'm done letting that happen." Silence fell hard after that. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Something shifted thin as a hairline crack, but enough for air to seep through. Riva sat straighter, studying him like a problem she couldn't solve. Lynn pressed her face into the blanket, her breath shaky but slower now, as if she'd stopped. Holding it for the first time in days, Darren didn't tell them what he was already planning that tonight. He'd start building something bigger than a locked door. Paper, records, names, a reason no one could challenge, because out here, paper mattered more than blood. He picked up the data slate, its screen flickering pale in the dim. His fingers hovered over the blank form titled Family Registration, Dependents. He didn't type yet. He just stared, listening to the soft breaths behind him, and thought about the promise he hadn't spoken out loud. No one's taking you. Not while I breathe. The heater hummed on. Outside, in the alley, fog slid like ghosts between rusted steel. And in the dead hush of District 9, someone else started knocking not on his door. Not yet, but close. Too close. Asterisk Chat-G said. The knock came, like a pulse in the dark. Not the hard clang of a scav looking for scraps. This was softer, slower, deliberate. Darren's fingers froze above the data slate. He killed the screen in one motion, set it face down on the bench, and reached for the wrench rifle leaning against the wall. Its weight settled across his forearms like an old scar familiar, cold, heavy enough to matter. Behind him, he felt the shift before he heard it. Rava moving. Silent as a blade sliding from its sheath, her bare feet kissed metal without sound. She was already between him and the cot, shoulders squared, body low, every nerve tuned to violence. Lynn stayed down, curled tight under the blanket, but her wide eyes glowed like frost in the dark. The knock came again. Click, click, then a pause, and the faint hiss of metal against metal wrong sound. Too sharp to be knuckles, too soft for boots. Darren's gut clenched. Someone wasn't knocking. They were cutting. He moved fast for a man with a brace, crossing the shop in 3 limping strides to the rear hatch. Pressed his ear against the frame. A new sound joined the first. A low thermal hum, crackling like heat on frozen steel. Plasma blade. They were burning through the lock. Darren didn't think. Thinking got you dead. He grabbed the manual override bar, rammed it through the inner latch, and locked it with a twist. Steel groaned as the blade bit deeper. Sparks popped. Through the seam, spitting blue light into the dark like tiny dying stars. He turned fast. Back corner, he hissed at Rava. Now. She didn't argue, didn't waste a breath. One hand closed on Lynn's arm, yanking her off the cot, dragging her behind the stacked crates by the heater. Rava crouched over her like a wolf shielding its mate, teeth bared in silence. The hiss sharpened into a screech. The hatch glowed at its edge dull red, turning molten white. 10 seconds. Maybe less. Darren braced his back against the wall, wrench rifle tight to his shoulder, sight fixed on the seam. Every muscle screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. This was the line. If they came through, he'd burn the first man in half and pray the second flinched long enough to matter. The metal gave with a scream. A hand pushed through gloved, slick with condensation. Darren squeezed the trigger. The wrench rifle bucked, spitting a slug of compressed steel through the frame. The intruder's scream was raw and short before boots scuffed in retreat. Another set of steps thundered away into fog. Voices snapped low in some dialect Darren didn't catch. Then silence, except for the echo of blood in his ears. He waited. 10 breaths. 20. 30. Nothing but the hiss of cooling metal. Lynn's ragged sob muffled against Rava's shoulder. Darren lowered the rifle slow, his hands shaking for the first time all night. He ripped the override bar free and shoved the hatch closed again, sealing it with every lock he owned. When he turned, Rava was on her feet, not shaking, not blinking, just staring at him with an expression carved from steel and something darker underneath. "You should have let them open it," she said, voice flat as frost. "I could have handled it." "You're not killing anyone," Darren snapped. "Not unless we've got no choice." Her jaw tightened, eyes glowing like molten amber in the dim. That wasn't no choice. That was them taking us back. They didn't, Darren said. Because I didn't let them. Her lips parted. Sharp words loading like rounds, but they never fired. Instead, she stepped closer, slow, like testing the weight of something invisible between them. "Why does this matter to you?" Her voice was low, dangerous in its quiet. Darren stared at her. Sweat burned cold down his spine. He didn't look away. "Because the last time I saw someone taken, I didn't stop it. This time I did." The air between them pulsed, tight and live, like a wire about to snap. Then Rava's hand moved small, quick not for the rifle, not for his throat. Just his hand? Fingers brushing his featherlight. A test. Darren didn't flinch. Didn't? Pull back. Her breath left her slow, like steam curling off steel. Behind her, Lynn's blue eyes shimmered from the shadows, wide and wet, fixed on both of them like she didn't dare blink. For a long second, no one spoke. The heater hummed on. Outside, boots splashed through distant puddles, voices fading. Into fog. When Darren finally broke the silence, his voice came low and hard, iron in the dark. "This place isn't safe anymore." Rava tilted her head, eyes still locked on his. "Then where do we go?" He looked between them at the bruises, the scars, the way Lynn clutched her own arms, like they were the last walls she had left, and made the call that would burn the rest of his quiet life to ash. "Down," he said, "to the lower bay. And after that, we disappear." Her fingers tightened on his, like she believed him for the first time. And that scared Darren Holt more than the men outside. Asterisk the hatch still smoked where the plasma blade had kissed steel. The shop smelled like scorched metal and fear, thick enough to choke on. Darren didn't wait for the silence to settle. Silence meant nothing on Belt Trax's silence was where the next hit came from. He slammed the manual override into place, grabbed the emergency pack from under the bench, and started moving. "We're not staying," he said without looking. "Back," his voice came flat, iron under strain. "On your feet." Now. Rava was already standing, shoulders coiled tight, scars glowing faint under the flicker of the heater. Lynn unfolded slower, limbs trembling, her fingers fumbling for the hem of the oversized shirt, like she thought it would vanish if she didn't hold on. "Where?" Rava demanded. No fear in her tone, just calculation. Teeth sharp behind every word. "Lower bay," Darren snapped, wrench rifle slung across his back. "And tunnels. If we're lucky, we hit the tram yard before they cut the grid." "Lucky?" Rava's voice cut like glass. "Alive," Darren growled. "That's as lucky as it gets tonight." He shoved a thermal cloak at her, another at Lynn. Rava caught hers without breaking eye contact. Lynn fumbled hers twice, before wrapping it around her shoulders like it was a second skin. Her blue eyes kept flicking to the door, as if expecting it to scream open and spit fire. Darren grabbed the haul pack, keyed the floor grate behind the workbench, and wrenched it up. A burst of cold, damp air rolled out, smelling of rust and mold and something older than light. "Down," he said. Rava dropped first without hesitation, body folding like a blade as she slid into the dark. Lynn hesitated just a flicker, a half breath, but when Darren's hand pressed steady between her shoulder blades, she swallowed. Hard and followed. He came last, pulling the grate shut and sealing it. With a madlock before dropping into the black, the tunnels swallowed them whole dot. It was like crawling through the veins of a dead. City rust-streaked pipes groaning with old. Water, cables looping like ribs in the dark. The only light came from Darren's wrist torch, a narrow beam cutting through mist that smelled of oil and old blood. Every scrape of boots echoed too loud. Every breath tasted like metal rot. They moved single file. Riva in front, Lynn in the middle, Darren last, rifle ready. His pulse hammered with every sound distant boots above, the whisper of a pipe shifting under stress, the faint metallic tap of something that wasn't them. Halfway to the junction, Lynn faltered. Her knees hit the grate with a hollow clang. Darren caught her arm before the sound could run wild. "Keep moving," he hissed, voice low but not unkind. I can't." Her whisper cracked in the dark. "Yes, you can," Darren said, pulling her close for a second longer than survival allowed. Her breath shook against his chest, warm and frantic. She tipped her head back, eyes catching the torch glow blue, like broken glass in the black. "Why are you doing this?" Darren didn't look away. "Because no one else will." Something in her face broke and mended in the same breath. She nodded once, shaky, then whispered so low he almost missed it. "You feel like home." The words hit harder than any bullet. Darren swallowed, jaw tight, and let her go. "And don't let home die in this hole. Move." She moved. They hit the junction in a burst of cold air and a flicker of red warning light from the old tram relay. The exit hatch loomed ahead, half buried in scaffolding and decay. Darren shoved the override rod through the manual latch and heaved. The hatch screamed, rust cracking like brittle bone, then gave way with a shower of dust and freezing fog dot outside. The tram yard stretched like a graveyard of metal giants. Broken cars lay gutted under collapsed beams. Floodwater pooled in black mirrors across the concrete, rippling under the wind that howled through holes in the dome above. Red emergency strobes pulsed faint and dying, painting the ruins in bloodlight. And there it was, the hauler. Half a carcass, half a promise its hull scorched, scaffolding draped like spiderweb over its spine. Darren's heart thudded once hard. If the fuel cell still held charge, they had a shot. "Go," he said, shoving Rava forward. She sprinted without question, boots splashing through shallow water, cloak snapping like a shadow behind her. Lynn stumbled after, legs shaking but fierce in their terror. Darren brought up the rear, rifle sweeping the yard, every nerve screaming for the sound he couldn't stop waiting for. It came, bootsteps, behind him, echoing through the steel. Bones of the old dome. Not one pair, many. Darren slammed the hauler's side hatch, fingers dancing across a pad older than sign. For a 6-second, nothing happened. Then the lock groaned, and the door hissed open, coughing dust into the cold. Inside. He barked. They piled in Lynn first, Rava on her heels, then Darren sealing the hatch hard enough to shake his bones. The interior stank of oil and mold. Panels hung loose. The engine bay flickered dead black. He dropped into the pilot's chair and slapped the ignition. The console spat static, then a low, coughing hum that rolled through the hull like a buried. Heart starting to beat. Outside, shadows broke from fogmen in armor, rifles slung, moving fast. Nets glimmered in their hands like silver teeth. The hauler's engine growled, sputtered, then roared. "Hold on," Darren said, voice a promise and a prayer all at once. The hauler tore free from its rusted grave, engine screaming as it clawed into the acid wind. The yard fell away in a whirl of steel and fog and distant, furious voices. Inside, the cabin shook like a dying animal. Lynn clung to the seat harness, eyes wide and wet. Rava crouched low, one hand on the floor, the other wrapped around a screwdriver. Sharpened to a killing edge, Darren gripped the controls, jaw clenched, breath burning his throat. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He'd made his choice. And tonight, the whole goddamn galaxy was going to bleed before he let anyone. Take them back. Asterisk the engines coughed twice before settling into a low, hungry growl. The hauler shuddered as it cut through the acid fog, climbing out of the tramyard's skeletal grave. Below, the broken bones of Belt Traxxas faded into black smog. Ahead, nothing but the void and the soft, electric hum of power cells Darren wasn't sure would last. He didn't speak. Not yet. His hands stayed firm on the controls, knuckles white, eyes locked on the flickering nav screen. Behind him, the cabin rattled like old bones, wires hissing with every vibration. Ling crouched against the bulkhead, clutching a strap in both fists, her silver hair clinging damp to her cheeks. Her eyes were wide blue shards in the dark, but calmer now, less like prey, more like something that had decided to keep breathing. Rava didn't sit. She stood near the rear hatch, legs braced, knife still clutched in her fist, the glow from the overhead strip painting her skin in harsh, green shadows. She wasn't shaking. She hadn't shaken once. But Darren saw the way her jaw locked every time the hauler groaned, the way her gaze darted to the hatch as if expecting it to rip open any second. "They won't follow," Darren said finally, voice low and flat. "Not beyond upper orbit. Costs too much fuel to hunt what they can't sell." Neither girl answered. Maybe they didn't believe him. Maybe they were too wrung out to try. The console chimed, a single soft note like a held breath, and Darren exhaled slow. Nav beacon locked. Destination: Hav Station. He'd never planned on going back there. Hav was a graveyard turned refuge. Mining colony gutted decades ago. Hollowed out and left to scavengers, then claimed by ghosts who needed somewhere law didn't reach. No records, no contracts, no questions. Perfect for people who didn't want to be found. 3 days. Darren muttered, adjusting the stabilizers. If this crate holds together. 3 days. In a tin can held up by rust and old promises, carrying 2 girls who'd never been anything but property until they crawled through his door. The thought settled like a weight in his chest, not heavy in a way that hurt. Heavy like something that mattered too damn much. The hum of engines smoothed into a low purr. The stars bled through the forward viewport, sharp and endless, scattered across the black-like teeth. Reva was the first to break the silence. "You didn't have to," she said, voice rough as sand, cutting through the hum. Darren didn't look. "Back? Didn't have to what?" Her eyes burned into him. "Fight for us, run for us, risk everything." His hands stayed steady on the controls, but his jaw clenched. "Yeah," he said. "I did?" Rava tilted her head, like she wanted to tear the answer open and see the gears inside. She didn't. She just slid the knife back into her belt and sank onto the floor across from Lynn. The smaller girl was watching Darren now openly, quietly, with that same broken glass blue that had cut through him in the tunnels. She whispered something then, so soft he barely heard it over the engines. "What?" he asked without turning. "You feel like home." The words hit like a punch. Not hard, just deep. They lodged somewhere under his ribs and stayed there, pulsing like heat. He didn't answer. Couldn't. The next 3 days bled slow and silent. They ate ration paste, drank recycled water, and slept in shifts on the hauler's single bunk. Always 2 at a time, never all 3. The first night, Ling curled up alone under a thermal sheet, trembling so hard Darren thought she'd snap in half. The second night, Rava stayed close to her, a silent shield, her eyes open long after Lynn. Slept. By the third, they lay tangled like roots, breathing in sync, and for the first time since Traxxas, the silence didn't feel like a blade. Hav Station loomed on the 4th dawn, a fractured sphere of steel and glass, floating in the void like a forgotten crown. Its dome lights burned low amber through layers of dust and storm scars. The comlink crackled once, then died, because Hav didn't care who came, or why. Darren set the hauler down on pad 19, hands steady even as his heart punched hard against his ribs. He cut the engines. The sudden quiet roared louder than the void. "This is it," he said, voice raw. "New start. No chains. No collars. No one owns you here." He didn't look back when he said it. He didn't need to. He felt it in the way the air shifted behind him, the way Rava finally uncoiled from the wall, the way Lynn's breath caught like a sob she didn't want anyone to hear. They stepped onto Have soil an hour later, boots crunching over red dust. Under the fractured dome, the wind here wasn't acid. It was thin, dry, carrying the ghost of old metal and the faint hum of power from patched solar lines. The unit Darren bartered for wasn't much. A metal-framed shelter on the edge of the dome, 2 rooms, 1 heater, a water line that didn't taste like rust. But it had a door that locked from the inside, and when it shut behind them, the sound didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a beginning. That night, Darren lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling seams, listening to their breathing from the cot, close, steady. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting to break. He didn't notice he'd fallen asleep until something warm brushed his shoulder. He woke to find Lynn leaning over him, silver hair spilling like light across her face. Her voice came soft as a secret. "We're not afraid anymore." Behind her, Rava stood in the doorway, silent, watching. But her eyes, those predator eyes, had lost their edge. They held something else now, something that scared Darren Holt more than any gun ever could. Asterisk. First sunrise on Have was a thin, pale thing filtered through cracked dome glass, fractured into golden shards by layers of dust. It spilled across the floor in quiet slants, turning steel gray into something softer, almost warm. Darren woke to it like a man drowning wakes to air, his body stiff from the cold floor, the hum of the heater barely reaching his bones. He blinked and saw them, not the feral shapes he'd found under a rusted awning on Beltraxis, but 2 figures curled together on the cot, draped in patched thermal sheets. Rava's hair was loose now, black with violet streaks spilling wild across the pillow, scars tracing faint silver maps over her skin where the collar once burned. Lynn lay tucked against her, face half hidden, lips parted in a breath that didn't shake anymore. For a long time, Darren just sat there, watching the rise and fall of their breathing, listening to the silence different now, less like a blade and more like a promise. Something in his chest loosened, a knot pulled so tight for so long it had become part of him. He didn't know if that scared him or saved him. Maybe both. The soft creak of the floor pulled him back. Rava had stirred. She pushed up slow, bare, feet touching metal, her eyes finding him across the room. That gaze still carried weight, the kind that could cut a man open, but the steel in it had softened. Beneath it, something burned warmer, something that made Darren's pulse climb in a way no fight ever had. "You're awake," he said, voice rough from too many nights without sleep. "I was watching," she said simply, as if it explained everything. Maybe it did. Lynn woke next, stretching like a cat under the blanket, her silver hair spilling in loose waves down her back. She blinked at Darren with those frost blue eyes, but they didn't look afraid now. They looked open. Fragile, yes, but not in the way glass shatters. In the way light filters through water-soft, fluid, unstoppable. Darren cleared his throat and stood, rubbing a hand over his beard. "I've got work. Panels need wiring. Filters need flushing." "No," Rava cut in, her voice like a blade, dulled just enough to not draw blood. "Not yet." He stopped, met her eyes. There was no command in her tone, not this time. No fight. Just something heavier, something that pulled the air taut between them like a live wire. "You said you'd wait," she said, stepping closer. Bare skin brushed against old metal as she moved, shadows and sunlight sliding over the curve of her shoulders. "That you wouldn't take unless we gave?" Darren's pulse hammered. "And I meant it. Good." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Because we're giving now." Lynn's voice joined hers, soft as a sigh. We don't want to be afraid anymore. Something in Darren broke then. Not a crack, but a release. A door swinging wide after years rusted shut. He didn't speak. Couldn't. He just let them close the distance, slow and sure, until Rava's hand found his chest, flat against his. Heartbeat, and Lynn's fingers slipped around his wrist like silk drawn tight. When their mouths met his, it wasn't hunger. It wasn't desperation. It was something heavier, something chosen. Rava kissed like she fought, fierce and certain, but her breath trembled when his hand slid to her hip. Lynn kissed like prayer, tender and endless, her body curving against. His with quiet need, the rest unraveled slow, layer by layer, until blankets tangled under them, and the world outside vanished like fog burned off by sun. There was heat, yes, and hands, and the soft rasp of skin against skin, but more than that, there was weight. The weight of two people who'd been nothing but property, carving their names into a space that finally belonged to them. To him. To all three. Later, the quiet returned, but it wasn't empty. It was warm, threaded with the hum of breath and the low thrum of hearts pressed close. Rava lay sprawled across his chest, scars bared without shame, her predator eyes closed for. The first time he'd seen. Lynn curled against his side, her fingers tracing idle circles over his ribs, as if anchoring herself in something real. Darren thought they were asleep when Rava spoke, voice flat but frayed at the edges. You should know why we mattered. Why? They wanted us back. He opened his eyes. Tell me. Her jaw worked once before words came. They bred us special. Not just for looks, for control, neural bonding, chemical response, to make us obedient. Her voice broke on that last word like it tasted of poison. We're wired to submit when triggered. It's in the blood. Lynn shivered but didn't pull away. Darren went very still. Does it still work? He asked, his voice low and steady, like a man holding back a storm. Rava shook her head. Maybe, if the signal's sent. If. Then. They'll never get the chance, Darren cut in, hard as steel. He slid his arm tighter around both of them, his voice dropping to something like a vow. You're not property. Not to them, not to anyone. You're mine now, and I protect what's mine. Rava stared at him a long, silent beat, then rested her forehead against his. Lynn's breath hitched once, then steadied as her hand twined. With his dot outside, Have-Station slept under its fractured dome. Inside, in a steel-walled shelter barely big enough to hold them, 3 people who had been ghosts learned how to breathe again. And for the first time in a long, brutal life, Darren. Holt felt something that tasted like hope, not the fragile kind. The kind you'd bleed for. Asterisk the end.